He thought he'd lost his daughter forever, until a poor orphan girl pointed at her portrait and whispered, "She was my friend." Graham Weston's mansion sat high above the city, a quiet glass fortress suspended between steel and sky. From the outside it looked magnificent, the kind of house people whispered about and pointed to when driving past. Inside, however, the silence was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that doesn't rest but lingers, pressing against the walls like a memory that refuses to fade. Tall windows let in morning light that fell in long pale stripes across the marble floor, but even sunlight seemed muted here, as though it too understood that this was not a place of laughter or warmth. It had not been for 2 years. Every room bore a sense of emptiness, not because they were unused but because they once held something precious that had vanished. In the main hall hung a portrait of a little girl, 4 years old, brown hair tied neatly with a red ribbon, dressed in a white blouse and black dress. Her eyes shone with innocence and mischief, caught forever in that painted moment. The brush strokes of her smile were delicate, almost tender. Her name was Amelia. She had disappeared without explanation 2 years ago during what should have been an ordinary day. There had been searches, posters, private investigators, donations, news interviews, desperate pleas, and sleepless nights. But eventually, the world moved on. Only Graham did not. He woke each morning with the same hollow ache, as if part of his chest was missing. People told him time heals, that wounds soften, that grief fades in slow degrees. But in his experience, grief simply learned to hide, waiting for quiet moments to strike. Graham dressed each day in a blue suit, its fabric crisp and precise, as though order and structure could hold him together. His hair was dark and always perfectly in place, his blue eyes sharp yet empty. He carried himself with the posture of a man whose reputation mattered, whose image had weight in the world. But anyone who looked closely enough would see a tiredness in the shape of his mouth, a heaviness in his steps. He was a man who continued breathing because breathing required no permission. His mansion staff worked softly, respectfully, careful never to speak too loudly or linger too long. They had seen their employer's heart break in slow motion, seen the carefully constructed composure he used to keep from falling apart. They never spoke of the portrait. They avoided looking at it for too long. The house had become something like a museum of memory, beautiful, curated, but unbearably still. One morning, his assistant informed him that a child from the local orphanage would be visiting as part of a sponsorship program. The idea had been arranged months ago, a philanthropic gesture recommended by his public relations team. Graham had agreed without thinking. He did not refuse anything related to children anymore. He did not have the strength to. When the girl arrived, she stood very quietly near the entrance of the hall. Her dress was clean but worn, white cotton with slightly frayed stitching, the fabric thinning at the sleeves. She looked small in the vastness of the foyer. Her hair was flaxen blonde, long and fine, her blue eyes wide and cautious, the eyes of someone who had learned how to observe before speaking. She held her hands folded in front of her, not fidgeting, not moving, as though fearing she might break something simply by existing too close to it. Her name was Lily. Graham glanced at her with polite acknowledgement, the kind he reserved for strangers, the kind that required no true attention. He was prepared to offer her a tour, a donation to her orphanage, perhaps a gentle conversation if necessary. But Lily did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the portrait hanging above the grand staircase. It was subtle at first, just a stillness in her posture. Then her breathing changed, becoming shallow, uneven. She stepped closer to the painting, her small face lifting slowly. Her lips parted, and a tremor rippled faintly through her expression, one that did not belong to curiosity, but to recognition. Graham's heart gave a slow, painful jolt, though he did not yet know why. Lily reached out and touched the wooden frame gently, almost reverently, as if touching something sacred. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but her words carried through the hall with startling clarity. "Sir, this girl, she was my friend at the orphanage. The silence that followed did not simply return. It crashed. Like a wave breaking. Like breath stopping. Graham felt the world tilt, not violently, but with a slow and devastating pull, as though everything he believed had just shifted into something unrecognizable. The house had been quiet for years. But now the silence was different. It was waiting. Graham did not understand at first. His mind tried to rearrange Lily's words into something else, something harmless, something that would not reopen every wound he had forced himself to seal. The hall seemed to close in, and the portrait, once just a reminder of loss, now felt like a question painted onto the wall. He stepped closer, slowly, as though movement itself had become heavy, as though the floor might crack beneath him. Lily stood perfectly still, her hand remaining on the frame as if she needed its support. "What did you say?" Graham asked at last, but the words came out rough, uneven, as if scraped out of his throat rather than spoken. He was a man known for calm, for measured tone and calculated pauses. But now his voice betrayed him. Lily turned to look at him, and her blue eyes seemed older than they should have been, eyes that had seen and understood more than a 6-year-old should ever need to. She did not flinch under his gaze, but neither did she seem proud or eager to share what she knew. She simply carried the truth as one carries a burden. "I knew her," Lily said quietly. "Her name was Mia. She slept in the bed next to mine. She took a breath that shivered faintly in her chest. She cried at night. She missed her dad." Graham's heart stuttered painfully against his ribs. Amelia had always called him Daddy. Mia. A nickname. A piece of her that still lived somewhere. Lily continued, not noticing the way his hands had begun to tremble. "She told me she had a daddy who loved her very much and that she didn't know why she was taken away. She said she used to live in a big house with windows like this one." Lily lifted her chin, her gaze flicking to the tall windows around them. "She said she tried to remember your voice so she wouldn't forget." The room grew impossibly still. Graham's breath did not come. The ache in his chest sharpened into something almost unendurable. For months after Amelia vanished, he had believed she must be close enough to feel him searching. He had called her name into empty rooms, certain she could hear him. He had whispered to her in dreams, begging the world to return her. And all this time, while his house remained silent, she had been crying in a place where no one reached her. "How long ago?" he asked, though the words barely formed. Lily's expression changed, something like sadness, but shaped by memory rather than emotion. "I think about 1 year. Maybe more." She pressed her fingers to her dress, gripping the fabric lightly, grounding herself. She had a red ribbon. She liked to braid it in her hair. She said her dad tied it for her every morning. The ribbon. He remembered tying it. His hands had learned the motion by heart. Graham looked up at the portrait again, and everything inside him ached. Not just grief anymore. Something sharper. Shock. Hope. Terror. Because if Lily was telling the truth, Amelia had not simply vanished into the world. She had been moved. Placed. Hidden. Taken. "Where?" he asked, though the question felt like a plea rather than a demand. Lily's voice stayed calm and steady, though her eyes softened with something like apology. "The orphanage where I lived before." She took another slow breath. But she didn't stay long. One day a woman came. She spoke to the director. She signed papers. And then Mia was gone. She didn't get to say goodbye. She just looked at me through the car window. And she cried again. There are moments when sound becomes memory. The ticking of the clock. The hum of the air. The soft distant rustle of trees outside. All of it became painfully clear as Graham stood there, his world rearranging itself one fractured piece at a time. His assistant entered the hall just then, beginning to speak, but froze when she saw his expression. She had seen him devastated before, on the day Amelia disappeared, but this was different. This was controlled breaking. Shattering with purpose. "Find the director of that orphanage," Graham said, his voice low but iron-hard now. "Now. And call Harris. Tell him to reopen every file." His assistant hesitated only a second before hurrying away. Lily still stood near the portrait, her small shoulders drawn inward slightly, as though unsure what came next. Graham looked at her, not as a visitor, not as a charity case, but as the child who held the thread leading back to his daughter. "Lily," he said softly. She looked up. "You did the right thing by telling me." Lily nodded once, but her expression didn't brighten. "She was my friend," she said. "And she missed you every day." That was when the silence in the house finally changed. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the breath before a storm. Graham did not sleep that night. The mansion, usually silent in a numb and distant way, now felt alive with tension. Every light seemed too bright. Every shadow seemed to be holding its breath. He stood in his study, hands braced on the edge of the desk, staring at files that had once been closed and buried. 2 years of reports, interviews, statements, leads that went nowhere. The pages had yellowed slightly at the corners from being looked through too many times, hope rubbed thin by repetition. Yet now, with Lily's words echoing in his mind, each document felt different, as if they had been written in a language he hadn't understood until now. Lily had been taken to the guest room to rest. She hadn't cried once. But her silence was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of someone who had learned early that crying did not bring adults running, that pain was something to be held privately. When the housekeeper tried to give her a blanket, she thanked her with a politeness that belonged to someone much older, and then sat on the edge of the bed as though she was afraid to disturb the sheets. She sat like someone who expected things to be taken away the moment she relaxed. Graham saw that from the doorway before he left her to sleep. It stung him somewhere deep, in a place he had ignored for too long. His investigator, Harris, arrived just after dawn. He was a man with sharp eyes and a steady manner, the kind of person who was not easily shaken. Yet when Graham relayed Lily's story, Harris's expression shifted. Not surprise, he had seen too many terrible things to be surprised, but recognition. A quiet understanding that some truths, once revealed, demand movement. "We'll start with the orphanage records," Harris said. "If the child was there, there will be paperwork. Even if they tried to cover it." Graham nodded, though his jaw was clenched so tightly it hurt. "She said Amelia, Mia, was taken by a woman. Someone signed for her." Harris folded his arms. "Illegal private adoption rings sometimes use orphanages as fronts. It would explain how the trail went cold so quickly." The words felt like acid. Graham had spent 2 years believing Amelia might have wandered, been lost, been hidden, been kept somewhere unclear. But the idea that she had been processed, handed off, documented, that someone had looked at her crying and signed a paper to make it legal, burned. He grabbed his coat before Harris could say anything else. "We're going." The orphanage was nothing like his home. The paint on the gates was peeling, the playground rusted, the windows clouded with fingerprints and age. Children's voices echoed from somewhere inside, some playful, some tired. Childhood here was not a soft place. It was something to be survived. The director, a woman named Mrs. Calder, met them in her office. Her smile was polite, but her eyes darted nervously when Graham mentioned Amelia's name. She tried to act confused, then tried to pretend she didn't recognize the description, then insisted records were private. But Harris was patient and relentless. He began asking questions she did not expect, names of sponsors, visitation logs, transfer papers. Every time she shifted in her chair, every time she swallowed, every time her hands trembled on her desk, her guilt tightened the room. Finally, Graham spoke, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. "My daughter was here," he said quietly. "Someone took her. And you let it happen." Mrs. Calder's breath hitched. Her face crumpled, not from sympathy, but fear. "I didn't choose where she went," she said quickly. "I didn't decide who she belonged to. They said." Graham stepped closer, his voice low and shaking. "Who?" There was a moment, a painful, suspended moment, where the truth hovered, trembling, refusing to remain hidden any longer. Mrs. Calder's voice came out barely audible. "The adoption was arranged through a private agency. They said it was for a wealthy family out of state. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want trouble. We never want trouble." Graham closed his eyes. He felt the world go very still again. But this time, the stillness was not paralysis. It was focus. He exhaled through his teeth. "You're going to give me every document. Every name. Every date. Every transfer. And you're going to do it now. Because I am going to find her." Mrs. Calder nodded, hands shaking so violently the keys jingled on her desk. As the files were brought out, thin folders with too few pages, names handwritten hurriedly, dates that didn't align, Lily's role in all of it came into sharper clarity. She was not just a witness. She was the one who had carried Amelia's memory when the world had erased her. A child who had remembered another child when no one else had. On the drive back, Graham's hands shook on the steering wheel. He had spent 2 years drowning in grief. Now grief had turned into direction. It was the first time since Amelia disappeared that he was moving toward her instead of away from the memory of her loss. And the storm inside him was no longer sorrow. It was purpose. The atmosphere in the mansion changed completely over the next few days. What had once been a silent, museum-like space now pulsed with tension, urgency, and the constant movement of people and information. Harris worked from the study, stacks of documents spread across the polished wood table, phones ringing with new leads, old names resurfacing, dead ends re-examined. Every hour someone called with something, a record found, a signed form located, a blurry security photo retrieved from storage. Graham hovered near the windows, always standing rather than sitting, his hands clasped behind his back, shoulders tight, his gaze distant and hard. He didn't speak much, but his silence now was filled with direction rather than emptiness. Lily moved quietly through the house, though she no longer seemed intimidated by its size. She watched the adults carefully, studying every expression, every word. Children who grow up without stability learn to read people the way others read books, learning to predict danger before it arrives. She never asked if Amelia would be found. She simply waited with a quiet, unwavering certainty, as though she had already seen the ending, even if she didn't know when it would come. Sometimes Graham found her sitting beneath the portrait in the evenings, her small knees drawn close to her chest, her eyes tracing the brushstrokes that formed Amelia's face. She didn't touch the frame this time. She simply sat with it, as though keeping the girl in the painting company. Once, he sat down beside her, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to be present. She didn't look at him, and he didn't speak. They sat like that for a long time, the silence shared instead of endured. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. A name. A signature. A woman who had posed as a private adoption facilitator. She had received children from underfunded orphanages and transferred them to buyers, wealthy families who didn't want to wait for legal channels. It was illegal, but difficult to trace because the paperwork disguised the children's identities. But one detail was unmistakable: Amelia had been taken under the false name Mia Garner. The woman's last known address was in a quiet rural area 2 hours outside the city, a place surrounded by tall pines and old farmland. The type of place where secrets could sit for years without being disturbed. Graham didn't hesitate. He ordered the car, and when Lily saw him preparing to leave, she stood from the staircase and walked toward him with silent determination. "You can't come," he said gently. She didn't cry, didn't argue, but her hands tightened into small fists at her sides. Her voice was steady, but very small. "If you find her and she's scared, someone she knows should be there." Those words hit him with a force he did not expect. He realized Amelia might not remember him the way he remembered her. But she would remember Lily. After a long moment, he nodded. The drive was quiet. Pine trees lined the road, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the sun seemed pale, hidden behind thin clouds. The house they arrived at was old, the porch sagging, the paint worn down to gray. A swing hung crookedly from the front beam, creaking softly when the wind passed. It looked like a place where voices were kept low, where doors were always locked from the inside, where children learned quickly which rooms they were allowed to enter and which ones they weren't. Harris approached first, his knock firm but not aggressive. A woman in her 40s opened the door. Her face was carefully composed, but her eyes flicked between Graham, Harris, and Lily with calculated caution. She tried to speak, tried to smile, even, but when Graham spoke Amelia's false name, the smile cracked. Her face changed. Not into guilt. Into fear. She ran. Not far. Not fast. Harris caught her easily just outside the porch. There was no violence, only a breaking of the thin thread of lies she had held together for too long. Graham didn't look at her. His focus was already past the doorway. The hallway was dim. The air smelled faintly of lavender soap. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, came the sound of small footsteps. Lily stepped forward before anyone else could. "Amelia," she called softly, voice trembling now, but not with fear. With hope. There was silence. Then another step. And another. A little girl with brown hair appeared in the doorway of a back room. Her hair fell around her face in soft, uneven strands. She wore a white shirt and a simple cotton skirt. She looked at Lily first, and something in her posture changed, like a shield lowering very slowly. Then she looked at Graham. Her blue eyes widened. She froze, small shoulders lifting with breath she seemed afraid to release. For a moment, the world held still. Amelia didn't run. She didn't speak. She only whispered one word, the word that had lived in Graham's chest as both wound and hope for 2 years. "Daddy." His heart broke so quietly he didn't even feel it. He stepped forward, not quickly, not with desperation, but with the gentleness of someone afraid to shatter something precious. She walked to him, one slow step at a time, and when he lifted her into his arms, the weight of her was real, warm, alive. Lily watched, her small hands pressed to her chest, eyes shining in the softness of the hallway light. And in that moment, the house full of grief inside Graham's heart finally opened, not to swallow him, but to let in air again. He had found her. But more importantly, she had been waiting for him. The car ride back to the mansion felt nothing like the drive there. Amelia sat in the back seat beside Lily, her small hand wrapped tightly around Lily's as though she feared letting go would make everything disappear again. She did not speak much, only watched the passing scenery with wide eyes, her expression changing with every new sight. She looked at the trees, the highway signs, the lights of the city as they drew closer, as if each one confirmed that the world she remembered was real. Graham sat in the passenger seat, turned slightly toward the back, but he did not push her with questions, nor did he try to make conversation. He simply watched her reflection in the glass, afraid to blink too long, afraid she might vanish if he stopped looking. Lily occasionally whispered gentle things, soft explanations, small reassurances, as though she were guiding Amelia through a fragile dream. When they reached the mansion, Amelia hesitated on the front steps. The house towered above her, the same structure her memory held, but larger somehow, quieter, more like a story she once told herself to fall asleep. She clutched Lily's hand and looked up at Graham, uncertain but trusting in the way children trust without needing to understand. Graham opened the door and stepped back, letting the two girls walk in first. The hall was bright, warm from the afternoon light, and the portrait on the wall waited silently, its painted eyes watching the living child now standing beneath it. Amelia stared at the portrait for a long time. Lily did not speak. Graham did not move. Amelia lifted her free hand and touched her own painted cheek. A breath shuddered through her chest, not a sob, not quite a cry, but something deep and fragile trying to find its way out. Graham crouched beside her, not touching her, simply lowering himself to her height. "You're home," he said, his voice barely audible and trembling with everything he had carried for 2 years. Amelia leaned into him then, not with the confidence of a child who had never left, but with the quiet surrender of someone who had finally stopped running. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, as though learning again how to hold what was precious. That afternoon, a doctor came to examine her. Amelia sat on the sofa, Lily beside her the entire time, and answered questions softly, calmly, pausing sometimes to glance at Lily for reassurance. The doctor's face grew tight when he saw the signs of malnourishment, the thinness of her wrists, the faint marks left by too much handling and too little care. Graham stood nearby, hands curled into fists behind his back, fighting the urge to storm out and destroy everything that had ever harmed her. The doctor advised patience, stability, gentle routine. She would need time to adjust. Her body would recover before her heart did. That evening, Graham prepared dinner himself, not because he didn't trust the staff, but because he needed to. He moved slowly in the kitchen, carefully measuring, stirring, cutting, the process grounding him when emotion threatened to pull him apart. He had not cooked in years, not since before Amelia vanished, but his hands remembered what his mind had forgotten. When he brought the food to the table, Amelia looked uncertain again, as though unsure whether she was allowed to eat freely. Graham noticed. Lily noticed. Lily reached first, picking up her fork, smiling softly, taking a bite. Amelia followed, tentative at first, then faster, hunger igniting beneath manners learned from fear. No one told her to slow down. No one told her to stop. Graham only watched her, tears burning but unfallen. After dinner, Amelia began to grow tired. Graham picked her up, not because she asked, but because when she rubbed her eyes and reached slightly toward him, the motion was instinctive. He carried her upstairs, into her old bedroom that had been left untouched since the day she disappeared. Her toys, her books, her tiny bed with the floral quilt, everything was exactly the same. She saw it, and something in her gaze softened. A memory found its place again. Graham set her down gently. Lily helped her change into soft pajamas. When Amelia lay in bed, she reached out one hand, not to Lily this time, but to Graham. He sat beside her and took her hand with a care that bordered on reverence. Her eyes fluttered with exhaustion, and her breathing steadied. Just before she slipped into sleep, she whispered something, so soft he almost missed it. "I didn't forget you." Graham bowed his head, the weight of that truth folding around him like warmth, like light returning after endless night. And in that quiet room, filled with the gentle sound of his daughter's breathing and the soft presence of the girl who had protected her memory, the house finally felt alive again. The following days did not unfold in dramatic revelations or emotional storms, but in quiet adjustments that revealed how deeply Amelia's absence had carved itself into the house and into her father. The mansion no longer felt like a silent monument, it now pulsed with cautious life. Yet healing was not simple. Amelia did not immediately laugh or run through the hallways. She moved gently, like someone who expected corrections for every action. When she reached for a toy, her hand paused midway, waiting for permission. When she spoke, her voice was soft, as though she feared being too loud. Graham saw these small hesitations, and each one cut him more sharply than any physical wound ever could. He rearranged his schedule without hesitation. Business meetings were rescheduled or handled remotely. The board complained, investors whispered, journalists speculated, but none of it mattered. Every morning, Graham woke early and sat with Amelia and Lily at breakfast. He asked simple questions, ones she could answer without pressure. What color did she like now? Did she want toast or oatmeal? Would she like to draw? Some days she answered. Some days she simply leaned against Lily, her face calm but distant, watching sunlight touch the edge of the table as though studying its warmth. Graham did not push. Love, he understood now, was not urgency. Love was presence. Lily, without being asked, became something like a bridge for Amelia. She did not crowd her or treat her like a symbol of miracle or tragedy. She simply stayed near. When Amelia woke from nightmares, breath tight and trembling, it was Lily who crawled quietly into her bed and held her hand. When Amelia hesitated to leave her room, Lily took her by the wrist and guided her through the hallways, step by step, reintroducing her to the space that once belonged to her. The staff learned quickly to follow Lily's lead. They spoke gently, moved slowly, and treated Amelia not as a rare porcelain figure, but as a child reclaiming herself. One afternoon, Graham found Amelia and Lily in the garden behind the house. Autumn leaves had begun to fall, scattering red and gold across the lawn. Lily was teaching Amelia how to fold a leaf into a small heart shape. Amelia was concentrating, her brows drawn together, her tongue peeking slightly at the corner of her mouth. Graham stood at the window for a long time, watching. For 2 years he had avoided this garden entirely. The last memory he had of it was Amelia chasing butterflies, her laughter trailing behind her like ribbons in the wind. Standing there now, he felt tears press behind his eyes again, but they were different. They were not sharp. They did not hurt. They simply came because he was watching something tender. Later that evening, when the girls went to their rooms to change for bed, Graham finally allowed himself to say what he had been turning over in his mind for days. He asked Lily to meet him in the study. Lily entered quietly and sat in one of the large chairs, her feet dangling above the floor. She did not seem nervous, only attentive, like someone who understood the weight of moments even if she couldn't explain why. Graham sat across from her, leaning forward, his hands loosely clasped. "You may not realize it," he began, his voice steady, "but you were the one who brought her back. Without you, I would still be searching in the wrong places. I might have never found her." Lily looked down at her hands. He continued, his tone softening. "I want you to stay here. Not as a guest. Not as a visitor. As part of this family." Lily did not react immediately. She did not gasp or smile or cry. Instead, she spoke the truth she carried like a second skin. "People don't keep me," she said quietly. "They are kind for a while, but then someone changes their mind. Or someone leaves. Or something happens. I don't want Amelia to lose anyone else." Her words were shaped by more life than 6 years should have contained. Graham felt something in his chest shift and settle, like a puzzle piece finally aligning. "I am not asking you to replace anyone. I am asking you to stay because this house is better when you are in it. Amelia is safer when you are here. And I am better when you are here." Lily lifted her gaze. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with something quieter and harder, trust slowly forming. "Will I have to leave one day?" she asked. "No," Graham answered, without hesitation. Lily nodded once, then slowly slid off the chair and crossed the room. She wrapped her arms around him, not tightly, not desperately, but with a simple acceptance that felt stronger than both. Graham rested his hand gently on the back of her head and closed his eyes. He had regained his daughter. But in the same quiet sweep of fate, he had gained another. And the house, which had once held nothing but echoes of loss, now held the slow, steady sound of family returning to itself. In the weeks that followed, life in the mansion began to expand outward, like a flower opening after a long, cold winter. Amelia grew more comfortable, little by little, showing fragments of the child she once was. Sometimes she laughed, sudden and bright, and the sound carried through the halls like sunlight. Other times she retreated into silence, especially when an unexpected noise or sudden movement reminded her of places she did not speak about. When this happened, Lily was always there, not hovering, not instructing, but simply sitting beside her until the tension ebbed. It was not dramatic comfort. It was familiarity, a presence that said, without words, "You are not alone." Graham noticed everything. He watched Amelia's gait strengthen, the way she walked no longer guarded. He saw how her smile stretched wider with each passing day. He also noticed Lily's quiet understanding, the way she stepped back when Amelia needed space and stepped forward when she needed grounding. It was clear they had formed a bond long before he ever learned Lily's name, one born out of fear and loneliness, yet now growing in warmth and trust. Autumn deepened into colder days, and the air took on the crispness of approaching winter. One evening, the three of them were in the library, the fireplace casting a soft amber glow along the rows of books. Amelia sat on the rug, sorting crayons by color, humming a tune she remembered from some distant before. Lily lay on her stomach beside her, sketching shapes on paper. Graham sat in the armchair near them, a book open but forgotten in his lap. He was not reading. He was watching. He suddenly realized he was content. Not the numb quiet he had forced on himself for survival, but the kind of peace that comes when grief finally begins to loosen its grip. It startled him. It felt fragile, like new glass, something to be held carefully with both hands. But peace, even new peace, must eventually share space with truth. There were still things he needed to know. He closed the book in his lap and spoke gently. "Amelia," he said, keeping his voice soft. She looked up, her hands still full of crayons. "Do you remember the place you stayed? The one before we found you?" The room stilled. Lily's pencil stopped. Amelia didn't shrink back or close off, instead, she lowered her gaze to the crayons, choosing her next words with care. Her voice was small, but not shaking. "There were other kids," she said. "Sometimes they were nice. Sometimes they cried." She stacked the crayons in a small pile. "The lady who took me said I was lucky. That I was going to a new family. But I didn't want a new family." She paused, lifting her eyes to Graham. They were steady, clear, and unbearably young. "I kept saying I already had one." The fire crackled softly. Graham's chest tightened, not with grief now, but with something heavier and warmer, love, fierce and unyielding. "Did they hurt you?" he asked quietly. Amelia thought again, choosing honesty over fear. "They didn't like when I asked about you," she said. "So I stopped asking out loud. I just said it in my head." Graham reached forward and gently took her hand. Her fingers curled into his with instant trust, as though she had been waiting for that moment to happen again. Lily spoke next, surprising both of them. "I promised her I would remember," she said. "Because someone had to." Graham looked at her, and an understanding settled over him like a slow dawn. Lily had carried Amelia's memory when the world tried to erase it. She had held on to something that was never hers to keep, but she had kept it anyway. And in doing so, she had saved a life, not by dramatic action, but by refusing to forget. There was another choice that needed to be made now, one that had been growing quietly inside him. The next morning, Graham went to his attorney's office. The paperwork was extensive, layered, formal, but entirely necessary. When he came home, he found Amelia and Lily building a blanket fort in the living room, the sound of soft laughter rising like a new song in a house that had gone too long without music. He approached them slowly, not wanting to interrupt more than necessary. Lily looked up first, her hair falling over her cheek, her eyes questioning. He knelt beside them, his knees touching the carpet, his voice steady. "Lily," he said, and she froze, sensing importance. "I want you to be my daughter too." The silence that followed was deep and full. Lily's expression did not break open immediately, she did not cry or smile or rush into his arms. Instead, she blinked once, her throat tightening, her voice no more than a whisper. "If I say yes, will I ever have to leave?" "No," he answered, with a certainty stronger than any vow he had ever spoken. "You will never have to leave." Lily's face softened, not into joy, but into relief, the kind that washes over a heart that has been bracing for loss all its life. She leaned forward slowly and wrapped her arms around him. Amelia followed a moment later, pressing her cheek to his shoulder. Graham held them both, one child returned, one child found, and realized that family is not always what is taken from you. Sometimes, it is what you choose to protect. Winter arrived quietly, soft snow settling over the city and blanketing the world in white. Inside the mansion, warmth filled every corner, carried by the sound of small footsteps and quiet laughter. The echoing emptiness that once haunted the halls had been replaced by life, not in loud or dramatic bursts, but in gentle, steady rhythms. Nothing about the recovery was perfect. Healing rarely is. Amelia still woke some nights with trembling breaths, clinging to Lily's hand before she remembered she was safe. Lily still paused before accepting gifts or kindness, as though waiting for something to be taken away. And Graham, though he stood taller now, still had moments when grief brushed against him, old memories rising like shadows before dissolving into the present. But none of this meant brokenness. It meant rebuilding, slow, deliberate, and real. The adoption proceedings took time, full of signatures, evaluations, and interviews, but Graham never wavered. When the final papers were approved and Lily's name was legally tied to his, he didn't hold a grand celebration or invite cameras. Instead, he took Amelia and Lily to the small garden behind the house. Snow lay sparkling on the grass, and the air tasted clean and bright. The girls ran ahead of him, their footprints crisscrossing in chaotic, joyful patterns. Amelia laughed, her breath forming clouds in the air, while Lily tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue. Graham stood watching, his heart full in a way he had once believed impossible. Eventually, he called them over and knelt in the snow, his hands warm despite the cold. He looked at them, one child returned, one child chosen, and felt the weight of the moment settle into him like a deep, quiet truth. "You are both my daughters," he said. "Not because of papers or names or who lived here first. You are my family because we found each other. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you are safe, and loved, and never forgotten." Amelia nodded solemnly, as though she understood every word. Lily didn't speak, but she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, small and fierce and certain. Over time, the mansion transformed again. The portrait of Amelia remained on the wall, but now Amelia herself stood beside it, pointing out details to visitors with the spark of a storyteller. Lily's laughter became a familiar sound in the kitchen, where she and Amelia helped the housekeeper bake cookies, ending with flour on every surface and in their hair. On cold evenings, they curled up by the fireplace, Amelia nestled against Graham's side while Lily stretched out beside them, their breathing syncing with the crackle of the flames. Eventually, Amelia began to draw again, filling page after page with houses, gardens, and smiling figures holding hands. Lily began to sleep without waking in the night, trusting that morning would bring the same home she fell asleep in. And Graham found himself smiling without force, laughing without guilt, and dreaming without pain. One night, near the end of winter, he sat in the library while the girls slept upstairs. He looked at the portrait again, not with grief, but with gratitude. The painting no longer held the last piece of Amelia he had left. It was now simply a reminder of where their story began, not where it ended. He understood something then, that loss had changed him, had hollowed him, had reshaped him. But love had rebuilt him. Love that came from searching, from surviving, and from choosing. Amelia had been taken, but she had never stopped waiting for him. Lily had never been his to lose, but she had become his to protect. They had all been fractured once, but now they were whole together. Family, he realized, was not something fate granted or denied. It was something people held on to, even when the world tried to pry their hands open. And in that quiet library, under soft lamplight and the calm hush of winter outside, Graham Weston finally allowed himself to believe in the future again. His home was no longer silent. It lived. It breathed. It loved.